December 2nd. I woke up in the chair where I fell asleep writing. The lamp's wick was low, and had burned down far too much of the kerosene before snuffing itself out. There's a spare can, but it won't last long. I'll have to be more careful. Bill was gone when I awoke. He had covered me with the quilt from the bed. I found him in the lounge inspecting the mounted moose heads and elk skulls. There were books, field guides and old almanacs, scattered on a coffee table. The wood stove was blazing, ticking with heat, but Bill wasn't relaxed. He greeted me in a whisper and moved tentatively through the room. I had nearly forgotten about his injury. "Let me have another look at your foot," I said. "You should rest in bed for a few days, now that we're safe." He shook his head. "We're not safe. Come look." He led me through the lounge and onto the porch at the front of the lodge. There is no snow or ice on the ground outside, but the road is muddy, the ground soft enough to hold indentations. From the porch steps, we saw the street and its quartz gravel, the small ruts we made walking from house to house in the dark last night. But now our steps are not the only marks in the road. There are other prints, too, evidence of pacing steps and sliding gashes where the gravel has been scraped completely away. It could be the tracks of dozens of pairs of feet, or just a few, going around and around the lodge while we slept. The footprints form an unbroken circle around us, evidence of the stalking, pacing, night watch of the whistlers. They have retreated now, apparently, but how far? In the moment, I could scarcely breathe. I staggered back against the lodge's front door, my body crumpling down and heaving. "In the stories, the whistlers don't leave tracks," I whispered. Bill shrugged and kept a stoic face. "They look human to me, like a grown man dragging his feet." His voice was low, tired. "What's wrong with you?" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if this is a game the whistlers are playing, or if the people of Red Hill reappeared last night to make these marks, to mess with us. Doesn't matter if it's aliens or mole people or fucking Lillian and Jeff back from the dead. We can't stay here now." He opened the front door and nodded me back inside. "We'll gather what we can and keep going south until we find another town. There's a closet with some gear, a good tent, tarps, lanterns, a stove. You start getting things together, and I'll see if I can find a vehicle that runs." I stopped in the doorway. I was breathing so hard I could taste blood. "No. We can't split up. We're no safer during the day than we are at night. We can't make that mistake a second time." He paused. "Fine. I'll take what we need from the closet. You have a look for food in the kitchen, then we'll pack up and scout out a vehicle together. Agreed?" I nodded, but was not completely reconciled with Bill's plan. How long can we run before hunger stops us, or the cold, or the harsh unknowns of the landscape? We saw this region from the air, saw the dead-end logging roads and ghost towns surrounded by miles of wilderness. We both know Red Hill has no outlet. The single road leads west, to an airstrip and a dock that freezes over every January. The mail comes by boat, and only in the summer. Bill knows there is actually nowhere we can run. Maybe the whistlers know it too. One task at a time. Food. I walked into the dining area, back beyond a buffet table waiting for chafing dishes, into the kitchen. It is thoroughly modern, with wood veneer cabinets and a walk-in freezer with a gleaming door. Someone put a lot of care into this kitchen. Perhaps. They photographed it for brochures. Bare tours have become popular among the wealthy and well-armed. The cupboards are nearly bare, as one would expect them to be at the close of the season. There is a bin with a few cups of stale flour inside, a bottle of rancid oil, a gallon-sized can of fruit cocktail, a box of crumpled tea bags, a canister of powdered milk, a stuck-together brick of sugar cubes. I opened the refrigerator, but the stagnant air behind the door poured over me, making me reel and gag before I forced it shut. I glimpsed molding vegetables, rancid meat, obscure plastic wrappings dotted with black mold. I must have gagged audibly, because soon Bill was at the kitchen door, eyes wild and shining like he'd been sprinting. "What's wrong?" he said. The fridge is full of spoiled food. He frowned. That doesn't make sense. They would have cleaned everything out before closing the place up for the season. But it wasn't closed up, I said. My voice was shaking. The front door was unlocked. The tables and chairs are still out. The TV cabinet in the lounge was wide open. The curtains weren't drawn in the bedrooms. Gas in the generator, he said, nodding. Nothing winterized. Like they left in a hurry. The back of my throat had gone dry. I walked to the freezer and yanked against the long steel handle, preparing myself for another wave of pungent odor, but deciding that spoilage in the freezer could be the final piece of evidence that proved the emerging theory, that something had gone very wrong for the residents of Red Hill. Bill stood at my shoulder, watching with a wary hand over his nose and mouth as the door's hinge creaked. The food on the shelves of the walk-in was actually better contained than what had been in the fridge. There was spoiled meat wrapped in paper, looking sunken and gory. The ice and ice cream had all melted within confined containers, as if power outages were routine. Besides a deeply musty, almost rubbery smell, at first I thought the freezer, though abandoned, was benign. "Ruth," Bill said behind me, his hand creeping shakily along my shoulder, trying to turn me back toward him. "Don't look, Ruth." "What?" And now I looked squarely to the back of the freezer, where a pair of rounded shoes was visible behind a pallet stacked with sunken bags of frozen vegetables. The steel floor beneath the pallet was shiny with dried fluids that had leaked from the bags, maybe days ago, maybe weeks. "Don't," he repeated, but I kept looking, following the shoes to a scrawny pair of legs, bent knees, the pleated black pants and white coat of the lodge's chef, a middle-aged woman with wiry white hair and a shriveled gray face. I took a step toward the dead woman, felt my bare feet sticking in the mess on the freezer's floor. Bill's grip tightened on my shoulders. "Look at me," he said. "Look away." "What happened here?" I breathed. He pulled me away, out of the kitchen, through the lounge, all the way back to the bedroom, where he gently shut the door and put me to bed, wrapping me tightly with the quilt. Just as sleeping beside Bill is different out of the wilderness, so death is freshly strange within the confines of the lodge. The dead chef makes less sense to me than Gary Law or the lighthouse keeper. She died indoors, in a place where the beds were still made, where the refrigerator was filled with food. She should have been safe. "Why would they leave her here?" I said. He knelt at my feet with a bottle of water and a washcloth, scrubbing the freezer's sickness off of them. I had left my shoes at the front door. Ages ago, it seemed. When he spoke, his voice shook. "What exactly did you hear last night? You woke me. You heard something." "A baby." It sounded like a crying baby. "The lighthouse keeper, he said he sometimes heard the whistlers laughing like his parents in the reception hall after church on a Sunday. They'll get inside your head. They'll lure you in. You can't let them, Ruth." I was dazed and couldn't speak, so Bill kept talking. "I imagine they were already here, in Red Hill, before we arrived. Spooked the residents. The power must have failed already, before she went in there. There was a parka on the hook outside. She didn't take it. Must have been a panic. She went in there to keep herself safe. Maybe people started leaving and she couldn't get out. It was all an accident," he said, rubbing my leg reassuringly. "They didn't realize she was trapped." "There's a bell," I said. "An emergency alarm." Her fingers, Bill. Her fingernails. They were scraped bloody on the door handle. Torn up. So maybe there was no one left to hear the bell. Maybe everyone else. But I sat upright on the bed. I couldn't calm down. That night, when it hailed, you would have done anything to make Ira quiet down. They got inside Ira's head, didn't they? Maybe they got inside hers too. You think her own people locked her in there? I tried to speak reasonably, tried for academic composure. "There's a story, isn't there? One of the old ones. A story about the people the whistlers don't kill? There's one in almost every group. Every story. Someone, susceptible, who succumbs to a kind of madness. Tearing at their own flesh, losing their minds, killing their companions. Lillian thought it was a kind of Stockholm syndrome." Bill nodded. He told me the story of the family who lived in the outpost north of the lighthouse. It was years and years ago. Mother, father, 3 children. The father sent a dispatch one day to say he had killed his wife and his kids. Strangled them. He had received a warning, he said, so he killed them all. When the rangers arrived, the residence was empty. There was no sign of any of them, no sign of struggle. As if they had vanished over the rocks and into the sea. Bill told me to lie down for the rest of the afternoon, but I couldn't. "I'm ready to go," I said, and we wasted no time. We packed our bags in a mournful silence. I was greedy, and overstuffed my pack, taking the quilt from the bed, spare batteries, candles, matches, mouthwash from the bathroom, and the remaining kerosene. Bill found a handgun in a locked drawer, plus ammunition. He had braved the freezer a second time, discovered the drawer's keys in a pocket of the chef's coat. "She wrote something," he said when he returned. There was a clipboard mounted on the inside of the freezer, an inventory log and a pen. The chef had scrawled a desperate message on the blank backside of a page. "I understand it now, after all these years, all these long winters of hearing those damn things howling out there in the woods. The whistlers stand with their backs to us. They stand between us and something terrible. They've been protecting us, all these years, keeping it at bay, whatever it is. They were warning us, all this time. And now it's too late. Too late by far. It's come to Red Hill at last. I've copied it verbatim. I can't stop thinking about it." "You were right," Bill said, shaking his head once he was finished reading. He crumpled the page and left it on a table. Stockholm Syndrome. I was wrapping the end of a fireplace poker with duct tape, but slowed and looked at Bill now, considering the chef's words. They caught Ira in a trap. "Yes," he said. "They didn't kill him. Didn't hurt him. He was well enough to find his way back to us. He escaped them. But I don't want to hear it, Ruth." I nodded and practiced swinging the poker against fire logs. Even now, all we have to go on are other people's words. We came all this way to conduct our own research, and the only thing we've learned is fear. We hear the whistlers, but have not seen them. We fear the unseen, but what if that's a failure of imagination? Perhaps there's something else to be afraid of, some reason the stories are so few and scattered, some reason there are so rarely any survivors, some reason Bill and I have made it this far. Some unknown. We wrote a note that we left on a side table near the front door. Our names and the date, contact numbers for our families back home, an apology that we didn't do more for the woman in the freezer. We couldn't spare the time and energy it would take to bury her. I put the kitchen parka on over my jacket and pants. Bill layered his clothes under Gary Law's. We took gentle steps away from the lodge, across the barrier line of whistler tracks, listening hard. In the light of day, it was clearer that Red Hill had been evacuated in a rush. There were split logs stockpiled beside every structure, potted plants drying out on porches, a garage door left open, its contents in disarray. "Not many vehicles," Bill said, as we walked to the far side of Red Hill, out toward the skinny dirt road that led out of town. "So this road must lead somewhere," I said hopefully. "They got in their cars and took this road out of town." Bill didn't seem encouraged. "To a dock, to an airstrip, maybe. I'm sure a town this size has emergency evac procedures. We could follow this road and end up at a dead end. Still, it's better than not knowing. It's better than planting our feet here and waiting to starve. Or worse." He tugged on his coat and squinted against the bright white sky. We looked into the houses along the main street. Most front doors were left unlocked, one had keys stuck in the knob, dangling. We found a loaded revolver stashed under a mattress and a dog trapped inside a bare kitchen pantry. It was a mutt, shaggy, pissed off. We opened the door and it shot away into the woods, didn't look back. Even that brief scouting wore me out. Bill kept looking over his shoulder, tightening his grip on the gun and staring around at every sound. My shoulders were aching under the pull of my pack straps. At last we found two worthy vehicles, each with slightly less than half a tank of gas, one a smallish van and the other a Jeep with studded tires and the keys sitting on the dash. Bill leaned his hands on the Jeep as if it meant we were saved, but I stood apart, unable to shake a sick feeling and the conundrum of the chef's final words. "What if we don't leave?" I said. "What?" "You said yourself there's nothing certain at the end of that road. We could drive to the coast and get stranded. We could end up on foot again. In the woods. Exposed. We're exposed here. Did you not see those tracks?" "I did. They surrounded us last night. They were everywhere. And yet here we are, standing in the street. Alive. For months the whistlers have been on top of us, but we're still breathing. Tell that to Lillian and Jeff. Tell it to Ira." He was yelling now, panting. Our faces were red close. I was blinking away tears, but I wasn't upset, just overwhelmed. "One more night indoors," I bargained. "Let me wash, and be warm, just one more time. I'm so tired, Bill. So tired." He didn't agree, not explicitly, but while we stood with the Jeep it started snowing, just the lightest veil falling between us. We returned to the lodge. He moved around with a sort of quiet, powerless violence, locking and barricading the doors, drawing curtains, checking and rechecking the guns. He parked the Jeep in front of the lodge and loaded the back seat with gear and tools, as if to remind me that our present comfort was necessarily temporary. We dragged the bed into the lounge, close to the stove. We moved the lounge's couches and tables toward the windows, then made the bed, almost reflexively, shaking the quilt out between us and draping it over the neatened sheets. Night was falling by then. "We're getting out of here at first light," Bill informed me. "I'm going to boil a kettle and take a bath," I said. He softened, just a little. "I saw towels in the closet." "The water pressure is low, but the faucets still work, drawing from the water tower, I assume. I only needed a few inches of cold water anyway. I didn't want to dilute the heat. I was eager to be cleansed of the dead chef, and Gary Law, and even Ira. Eager to get the smell of the forest off of my skin and start forgetting the things we'd done to stay alive. I took my hair down while the water dribbled into the tub. It had grown long, and had coalesced into oily tendrils since the last time I washed it. There were split ends and strands of gray. Ira always liked it long. I thought about cutting it off with my pocket knife, thought of how light and unencumbered I would feel once the oily heft of it was gone. I think about getting clean the way I think about eating and drinking. It's a need I can't imagine anyone taking for granted, that feels like it may never be completely satisfied. I hadn't added the hot water yet when I was interrupted by the sound of Bill barreling through the hallway. He opened the bathroom door, saw me halfway undressed and with my hair down, and closed it abruptly. He spoke through the door in a rush. "It's them." We're away from the windows, in the front hallway, listening to them, the howl, high-pitched, nasally, throaty. It's so hard to define. The terror is not just something I remember and have learned to feel, but innate. I experience the fear of the sound on some deep, unconscious level. It is a warning, clicked into the deepest part of my mammalian brain. Danger. Bill held my fire poker and both guns, gave me my choice. I took the revolver, only 4 bullets left in the cylinder. He took the handgun and its full clip. He rested the poker and the hatchet against the wall and stood behind me near the doorway, pressing his body against my back, his mouth to my ear. "At least 4 of them," he murmured, close enough I could hear footsteps. The sound came from every direction. The whistles were like car horn blasts, so loud the tendons in our necks tensed. The porch steps creaked, but our angle was awkward. I could barely see the front windows from where we cowered, and the low light from the stove and the electric lanterns barely reached the door. "We could go out through the kitchen exit," he whispered between hard breaths. "To the furthest cabin. No lights. Run for it." It was a fine plan. The whistlers might be attracted to the light and heat of the stove, and the lanterns might not notice us slipping away. Yet at that moment I didn't have it in me to flee again. If they drove us from the lodge, who was to say they wouldn't drive us from a cabin and back into the woods? We couldn't survive being out there again, not in the looming snow, not just the two of us. I thought of the wash line and tents we abandoned the day we lost Ira, and how our flight across the valley had cost us. "No," I said. "Not again." I charged away from Bill, straight toward the front door, where the whistlers murmured. I threw open the door despite Bill's warning cry, and saw only one figure beyond it, a dark, lanky shape on the bottom step, swaying listlessly, skeletal shoulders hunched beneath a head of shaggy hair. I was blinded by fear, and I raised the gun as I stepped out onto the porch. I fired. I saw his face in the flash, a swollen lower lip, empty eyes, hair clinging wetly to a fevered forehead. He felt like the wind had blown him down, instantly dead, and a moment later I was with him, laying my body on top of his, crying against his face and asking for forgiveness. I couldn't hear anything, but Bill told me later that there were no whistles, no sign of them, just Ira, just his blood and footprints on the walkway and the steps. Bill carried us inside, first me, then his brother. He lay Ira on the floor and I lay down with him, pressing my face to his stone-quiet chest while its warmth ebbed away, asking him weeks' worth of questions whose answers we can never know now. December 5th. Bill left me there with Ira that night. He shut the doors of the lounge and slept in the bed alone. I have kept Ira's body for 3 days, trying to comprehend it. His right arm is missing. Torn away, the wound crudely cauterized somehow, but deeply infected. He was barefoot, feet frostbitten, his eyes riddled with broken vessels, hair missing in patches, the nails of his left hand grown and worn like claws. "He wouldn't have survived the night," Bill keeps saying. "Don't blame yourself." I shaved Ira's face, but it didn't help. Didn't make him look any more human. I could hardly see him anyway, through the tears. "The moment you opened the door, it stopped," Bill said. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Are you listening? The whistling. It stopped all at once. I didn't see any of them out there. I didn't see anything but you and him." "I saw his face," I said. "It's all I saw." The prince circled the cabin, and Ira walked among them. We know that much. Since that night, we haven't heard the whistlers. Not once. December 7th. Bill dug Ira's grave today. It snowed hard the night before, and the topmost crust of soil was frozen, and digging was punishing work. It took hours. I thought we were desensitized to death, but I found him sitting on the edge of the hole when it was done, his legs dangling down, sobbing into his hand. I didn't know what to do, so I sat beside him. Ira was inside the lodge still, rolled in a pale yellow sheet, wrapped up so we couldn't see his face. We sat there together for a long time, both of us pretending we were safe and he was alive and the hole was anything other than a grave. I felt the cold in my joints like shards of glass. "Why don't we lie down with him?" Bill said, meaning down in the hole. I stroked the back of his head. I couldn't think of a good answer. It seemed to me we'd been offered plenty of chances to die and declined them until now. I looked into the dark of the hole, whose bottom was settling with tiny snowflakes that didn't last. The snow would fill the grave over us, eventually, preserve our bodies from the whistlers until the residents of Red Hill came back at start of the dry season. I've heard freezing is a gentle death, like falling asleep. Bill left my side, carried Ira's body to the grave, hefted him down, and then came up again, standing and pulling me up beside him, taking me away. "I'm sorry," he said, though I still hadn't spoken a word. "Don't listen to me." December 9th. We had a baby, Ira and I, 5 years ago today. She was born with a heart defect and didn't live long, didn't ever leave the hospital. I have scars. Her name was Catherine. Ira left town. Before the funeral, went to a medical conference 2 states away. But Bill was there. He got drunk and cornered me in his mother's living room. "She should have been mine," he said, so close I could smell the whiskey. It's why Bill doesn't believe me when I say I hear an infant's cries on the wind. He knows it's Catherine's birthday. He thinks about her too. I hear her wailing in the early evening, often just before the whistlers start to howl. An overture, a prelude. We're out of food. Each night, we build a fire in the stove and sit before it with shaking hands, with cups of tea. There is snow on the ground, snow to reveal that the whistlers haven't circled close since Ira died. There are no tracks but our own. I've started asking myself the question, in practical terms. If I have some choice in the matter, how would I like to die? Would I choose to go as Catherine did, swaddled and sedated, in my mother's arms? There was a time when I thought I wanted to die fighting, my knife in my hand, knuckles red from the cold. I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure I have the patience for that. Everything is different since we buried Ira. The difference is between us, yes, and in the atmosphere of Red Hill. Bill doesn't bustle around the way he used to, doesn't sit vigil at the windows and watch the distant trees. There is something we've discovered beyond fear. A separate emotion, a detachment. All that matters is the heat of the fire, the weight of blankets. We hardly speak anymore. December 13th. Bill leaves the lodge every afternoon now to look for food. He says he wants to go alone, and I don't argue. He's made a few good finds: popcorn, instant coffee, noodles, dried parsley, half a bottle of bad gin. Each day he circles a little further out, stays away a little later. Last night he didn't come back until an hour after dark, until I'd already heard the mournful chorus of 2 whistlers far away, in the woods. I thought of walking out to them, in my desolation. I want to see their faces. Want to know my tormentors. When I try to envision them now, all I see is Ira at the end, his gaunt face and yellowed eyes. Do they suffer, as he suffered? Would I recognize their faces? When Bill came back, he pressed a pack of chewing gum into my palm and went straight to bed. He was limping on his bad foot. He had walked too far. "Why were you out so long?" I asked. But he rolled over against his pillow. Pretended not to hear. December 15th. There are about 6 inches of snow on the ground. I spent the day stacking firewood on the porch. Bill stayed close, at my insistence, wandered through town like a tiger in a small cage. There is nothing left to eat in Red Hill, and no game nearby, nothing but coyotes and wolves. In the early evening, he walked across the road with a gas can, siphoned fuel from the van, which is parked outside a gray house just up the street. I watched him from the porch. He looked up from his work to look back at me, to meet my gaze through the falling snow. We might go to the coast after all. For all we know, there's a radio out there, a phone, some other means of contact we've overlooked. Maybe the Coast Guard will send a patrol. Maybe someone has been looking for us all this time. Bill stopped staring. His head turned suddenly, toward the woods behind the houses, like he'd heard something, a snapping of twigs. "What is it?" I called, but he didn't answer. He walked a few steps toward the woods, craned his head, but then a streak of brown and black emerged through the trees, went straight for him. There was a deep growl, a scuffle of motion, and Bill's strangled cry. A dog. The dog we'd released from a pantry days before. I sprang from the porch with a stick of firewood in my hands, but was too late. Bill had slipped in the ice, fallen hard against the edge of the van's bumper. The dog tore into his leg, but released it as Bill fell, lunged for his face. I swung the splintered edge of the firewood squarely at the poor beast's skull. He was like us, starving, a skittish mutt made savage by the cold. Bill was dazed, scraping for purchase in the snow behind me, trying, in vain, to stand. The dog cowered away from me, and it seemed cruel to swing a second time. So I screamed instead, at the top of my lungs, shouted at the dog to run. And he did. He turned, he lowered his body and went slowly toward the woods close by, cowering deeper, like he didn't want to go back into the trees. But I was full of adrenaline now, and yelled a second time, so loud that my voice echoed off the houses, and something answered me. It was a strange roar, a rumble like a rock slide mixed with an animal scream, like a panther. It came from the woods where I had driven the dog, and now I heard the mutt whimpering, the screaming and the whimpering and Bill's muddled murmuring behind me, and I found myself backing toward him, through the snow, almost senselessly, until a new sound erupted and overcame the others, the whistlers. Their voices rose, familiar now, surrounded us until I couldn't hear the shrieking roar, the whimpering dog, couldn't hear Bill's exhausted breathing or my own beating heart. I turned, suddenly focused, and grabbed his hand. He had been holding his pistol, aiming it unsteadily toward the woods. I took it now, and heaved him upright. He was woozy, bleeding freely into the snow. Gary Law's khaki pant leg was soaked red. There was blood on his head, too, a scrape from a bolt on the van's bumper, not deep. His eyes were half closed. "Stay awake," I said, grabbing Bill's chin more roughly than I meant to, yanking him toward the lodge. The whistlers' cries were harrowing, but helpful now. They seemed to propel us onward, made us focus on the fear, the imperative of flight. The dog had bitten Bill's bad leg, the one already weakened by his twisted ankle. He could walk, but he was shaking. I helped him across the street, helped him up the porch and into the lodge's dining area. He collapsed into a chair, leaned his body against the table. He was grimacing horribly, and we were losing daylight fast. I cut away his pant leg with my knife. "You're going to need stitches," I said. The dog bite was an arc of puncture wounds, with a deep gash torn near his shin. The wound on his head was bloody, but not horribly deep, not as bad as it looked, a scrape only, a shock. And now the blood was seeping slower. I set an electric lantern on the table, but it still wasn't enough light. "Headlamps in the lounge," he said. When I went for it, I remembered the bottle of cheap gin. "Find it?" Bill called to me. There was pain in his voice. I made myself hurry. There was alcohol hand sanitizer in my pack and a spool of surgical silk and steel needles. Ira had put the first aid kit together with his own skill set in mind. I poured water on the wounds, washed the blood away and watched more take its place. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know what I'm doing." I wiped sanitizer on a needle and then doused the gash on his leg with it. He reeled where he sat as the alcohol burned. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "You're doing fine." I handed him the gin bottle before I started stitching. It was half full, and Bill took grateful swigs before nodding at me to get on with it. The skin was harder to pierce than I expected, but Bill seemed able to center himself amid the pain. He closed his eyes and only grunted a little each time I pulled the thread through. He kept saying it was okay, that I was doing fine. Finally, I tied off the thread and taped a square of gauze over my work. I sat at the table afterward, sweating inexplicably, exhausted, feeling there was more I should do, replaying the noises in my head, the sequence of events, the whistlers and the thing that had answered my shouts. Bill walking toward the woods, the sound, the dog. What came first? It was jumbled already, the memory. I've recorded it here the way that makes the most sense. The moon was rising, and we leaned into each other, both of us looking away at the deepening shadows, looking through the windows for signs of life, finding the night remarkably, horribly, quiet. He drank from the gin bottle again, then handed it to me. It was harsh and cheap, but I took more than one burning gulp. "Suppose the dog was running from it?" Bill asked. I shrugged, but something dreadful was welling up inside of me. I stood up, and turned in a useless circle, and felt hot tears falling, felt the desperation and spoiled hopes of the past weeks rolling over me. I was collapsing, and leaned toward the table to steady myself, but Bill caught me before I could. He stood and held me against his chest, one easy movement, one hand against the back of my head. He was breathing in the same uncontrolled gasps that had overtaken him on the trail before we saw Red Hill, when he was balancing between despair and a kind of jovial release. He pulled my hair down, smoothing it between his hands so my head tipped back, so I had no choice but to look up at him. My vision cleared, tears stopped, and then we were breathing together, our eyes locked and bodies reacting like two leaves tugged down by the same current, deciding what came next. He shook while he lifted my shirt over my head. "Bill." He kissed me then so I couldn't speak, and he was right to. There was nothing whatsoever to say. I followed him to the lounge, to the bed. He sat back and pulled me on top of him, wincing as he leaned against the cushions, but still holding me with a tense grip, still saying yes. It didn't seem the stove was pumping out much heat, but I took everything off, wanting him to see me and the body so much walking and hunger and fear had made, wanting to feel tangible and whole on this night when our existence was impossible to take for granted. He kissed my neck while he made love to me, and whispered that we would make it through the winter, make it to the coast, make it home. I have to believe him. December 17th. Bill was pale the next morning, weak, but he wouldn't stay in bed when I asked him to. He hobbled around the lodge, gathering more gear, hauling it out to the jeep, dragging the gas can up from where we had abandoned it in the road. I made him some broth, but he wouldn't eat, and in the afternoon he walked away toward the woods, toward the place where the dog ran and the roar sounded. He walked toward the trees and stopped and stared, and when I hollered from the porch, he didn't look back at me. I tried to follow, to fetch him, but it seemed, even limping, he took 2 steps onward for every one of mine. He went on until he was in the trees, out of sight, and as much as I wanted to, I couldn't make myself follow. I stood in the frozen road and shouted for him, but I didn't have it in me to enter the woods. I lay in bed through the night with open eyes, hearing the whistlers soft, far away. Like a lullaby. I heard Catherine on the wind. The tears come much easier when I'm alone. I found him this morning, sitting on the porch steps, facing out, with ice in his beard. I touched his neck and he held my arm. He seemed alert. He looked into my eyes. "What happened to you?" I was nearly crying, but he didn't respond. He just rubbed my arm and let me lead him inside, watched me through saddened eyes. Later, once he was warm, he said he had gone to the woods to listen to the whistlers. He said he could understand them now. "Don't say that, Bill." I cried into his shoulder, pressed my fingers to his lips, but he was calm. "It's okay, Ruth. We'll go to the coast tomorrow. You'll be safe." "We'll be safe," I said. He nodded and held me tighter. December 18th. It was sad, pulling out of Red Hill, watching it shrink behind us until it was closed off by a ridge of granite and a curtain of trees. It felt momentous, almost like this was the beginning of our journey again, like we were grad students, me with my love of reading and him with his lust for the outdoors. I had married his brother, and he always wanted to get closer, and one late night in the office, grading papers, we had a crazy idea. I wrote the grant application, he planned logistics. Ira took a sabbatical, volunteered. I met Lillian at a conference. All we saw was how our interests aligned. We went out for drinks, the whole group, all together. Talked about how much fun it would be. We were barely in the Jeep 40 minutes before we ran out of road. Our path terminated in a wide lot of pale brown gravel. There was no airstrip, just a rutted lot with puddles that had turned to slush, A floating dock slick with ice, and a boathouse with 2 broken canoes inside and a rusted hole in its roof. I was driving, because Bill was ill, leaning against the window. His leg hurts him. It's badly bruised, and the scrape on his head isn't healing. He stared straight ahead, once we were parked, stared through the windshield with tears forming in his eyes. I don't know what he was expecting. It was hard to see that we were at the edge of the earth now, out of options. You know, Bill said, sniffling and wiping his nose. In the olden days, people would walk into the sea to kill themselves. There's something poetic about it. Not in real life, I don't suppose. I've never seen anything poetic in a dead body. He reached for my hand across the gear shift. I'm not going back to Red Hill, Ruth. I can't. Not now. I can't look at Ira's grave again. I can't walk through the kitchen and pretend there isn't a corpse in the freezer. I can't. What else is there? He shook his head. There's the rub. I pulled my hand away and got out of the Jeep. It was impossible, holding my thoughts together. I wanted to stop struggling, but not to die. Wanted Bill to stop feeling pain, but not to be alone. Wanted to end both our suffering. Wished I had said yes days ago, when Bill laid Ira in his grave, when he asked if we should lie down too. It was windy at the coast, so cold my cheeks burned. I walked down toward the dock, but couldn't go far without risking my footing on the ice. Bill was watching me from inside the Jeep, waiting, I suppose, to hear me say I was ready to give up too. But I wasn't ready. I closed my eyes, felt the embrace of the wind, and deep within the hush of it I heard the cry again, my little Catherine's cry, and a voice, a man's voice, Ira's, singing to her. Bill got out of the Jeep and looked toward the sound. Whistlers, he said. Is that what you hear? I walked toward it. Where are you going? Bill called. I waved that I was okay, and walked around the useless boathouse, up a low hill of sliding gravel. At the top, the wind was stronger, swirling with tiny snowflakes, and I could see more gray water up the coast, could see distant glimpses of shoreline segmented by trees, and low surf, and a bobbing shape, white and blue, lodged against a spit of dark sand. I rushed back down the hill toward the Jeep, sliding in the gravel, panting hard. What is it? Bill asked. There's a boat, I gasped. Get your pack. It was impossible to take the Jeep directly up the beach. There was too much loose gravel, too many jutting black rocks in our path. We had to wind in and out of patches of forest, had to boost each other over boulders, had to trudge through coarse sand. I was relentless, forcing myself onward, climbing every dune to confirm the boat was still in sight, still a small blue and white ketch with bare masts and an enclosed cabin. The sound led me onward all the while, the sound of Ira and Catherine, the sound Bill kept pausing to warn me of, the sound he said was whistlers, luring us into a trap. It looks abandoned, Bill said once we were near. He was clutching his leg, holding the place where I was sure his bite wound had opened. I never offered to stop, to slow down, to do anything but press onward. I felt certain about the boat, that it was waiting for us, destined for us, our salvation. We slid down a final scree slope and reached the gray pebbled beach where the boat was moored. Or not moored exactly, but stuck. It was surrounded with driftwood and other debris. Bill looked exhausted, unimpressed. It's a death trap, Ruth, he said. The tide is coming in. Come on, help me get inside. The tide will take us out, and the Coast Guard will find us. The Coast Guard will not find us. This area will be iced over in a month. It's suicidal. Do you know anything about sailing? My dad owned a ketch. We didn't go out much. I wish. But as I spoke, Bill turned away from the boat and stared into the trees. He was flexing his hands, trembling. Do you hear that? I did hear it. snapping twigs, the moaning bend of a branch. Then, the whistling, deep in the trees, coming closer. Bill was breathing hard, backing toward the boat, keeping me behind him. As the whistling rose in front of us, so the wailing rose behind, the crying, the singing, summoning me backward, summoning me into the boat. The tide was already rising, the boat bobbing in water that was almost deep enough to whisk it away. "I hear Ira," I said. "What?" Bill gave me a bewildered, almost angry look. "I hear him singing. I hear Catherine." He looked sad for me, and reached for me, but I backed away, into the water. It rose over my shoes and soaked my socks, icy cold. "Don't, Ruth," he said. "I'm getting on the boat, Bill." There was a ladder down one side of the hull. I could wade to it and pull myself inside. I didn't need his help. "You said you wouldn't go back to Red Hill? This is what's left. This is the other choice." The whistling in the trees grew louder, and every second the beach felt smaller, more like a trap. His face changed, and the wind rustled his hair. "Yes," he said strangely. "Yes, you're right. Get on the boat, Ruth." I turned and waded toward the ladder, telling myself he would follow, telling myself all would be well. "Why can't you hear it, Bill?" I said, as I reached the ladder, as I pulled myself up onto the weathered deck. "Why can't you hear Ira singing?" But when I turned around, Bill was halfway up the beach, looking small, facing away from me, his skin white and his arms rigid. "Bill?" I called. The boat was creaking in the deepening tide, and the wind was rushing across the sand. The boat jolted beneath me. Something dark appeared beyond the tree trunks, something I could barely see. It was moving, a shadow independent of the shifting needles and swaying branches. A shape, a being, taller than a man and deliberate in its movements. I raised my revolver in shaking hands. I fired, more than once, but there was no reaction. The sound was lost among all the others, the screaming and gnashing, the howl of the whistlers. Bill was close to the woods now, he had to see it, but he was paralyzed, as straight and immovable as the trees. I screamed for him, wishing he would look at me, but he didn't move, and beneath me the boat shifted again. I fell, hit my head on the icy rail, and once I had scrambled upright again, Bill had fallen. He was collapsed on the sand, and the creature was looming closer to him, coming through the trees, crouching down. The whistling hushed, suddenly, almost completely. Even the wind seemed to ease. It takes its prey one at a time. I couldn't hear Catherine anymore, or Ira, but I could hear the whistlers, the softest warning tone, intelligible now, almost like words, telling me to close my eyes. There is always one survivor, always someone spared. The wind pushed the ketch away from the shore, and the darkness closed over Bill. I don't remember anything else. December 22nd. My name is Ruth Gattiger. Please bring my body back to Oregon, if you can. My driver's license is in my wallet. This account of events is for the families of the deceased, for the helicopter pilot and Lillian and Jeff, for Bill and Ira's mother, and the chef we found in Red Hill. I don't want it published. I don't want to be one more link in the chain of juvenile curiosity, another mystery in the big book of stories that sends people like us to places like this. To die. We had so many opportunities, over the years, to drop the question. To live with the unknown. We called ourselves folklorists, but we imagined we were adventurers, righteous explorers, exposing a mystery. We imagined we had the right. I never thought the whistlers were real, before coming here. I thought they were a dark side of the human psyche, just one of many predictable byproducts of human life in cold, isolated, untenable conditions. I wanted to sit around a fire with shifty-eyed fur trappers and remote homesteaders and listen to their spooky stories, like a tourist. We didn't satisfy our curiosity. Coming here didn't pick apart the tangled lore. We only satisfied the hunger of the thing that stalks this place. It's been here a long time, the chef thought, at war with the whistlers. How long have they kept it at bay? It doesn't even have a name. At this late hour, I find I can't put a description into words. And I don't want to, because I realize now there are some things we don't deserve to know. There are stories we shouldn't tell. Unknowns that should remain unknown. I should have done this in the Jeep with Bill. It would have been better, but not necessarily easier. To die in the back seat, in his arms, warm, staring out at the ocean. The boat ran aground on a sandbar, not far from where I lost Bill. I've been wandering down the coast. I made it back to the Jeep. There are no whistles to follow me now, nothing watching from beyond the trees. The snow is deep, and the land has gone quiet. For how long? I don't know. I don't know if I was spared, or if the evil that lives here is merely biding its time again. If you've found this, the backpack, thank you, whoever you are. I'm out of gas, out of food, and at night, no matter where I look, there are no lights in any direction. It's cold. I'll close my eyes for a little while. There is still one round in the revolver. I haven't made up my mind,